impermanent were an error, since in emptiness there is nothing impermanent, how could that grasping be an error? This verse adverts to the first of the four principal errors, that one of the five aggregates, typically consciousness, is permanent. The reason that it is held by Buddhists to be an error, of course, is that all of the aggregates are analyzed as impermanent, hence the formulation in the second line, whose definite description must be read to re. But, Nagarjuna argues, since there are no actual impermanent phenomena from the ultimate point of view, this can't actually be seen as the false attribution of a property, permanence, to a real entity that actually has a contrary property, impermanence. The point here is simply that in calling this an error, one must be very careful not to commit a corresponding error to suggest that calling the impermanent impermanent constitutes the assertion of an ultimate truth or of the presupposition of the ultimate reality of impermanent phenomena. That is at best a true conventional assertion that indicates the ultimate nature of things. This claim is made explicit in 23:14.
14. If to grasp onto the view, the impermanent is permanent, were an error. Why isn't grasping onto the view? In emptiness there is nothing impermanent, an error. 15. That by means of which there is grasping. And the grasping, and the grasper, and all that is grasped, all are being relieved. It follows that there is no grasping. The argument above addresses the first and fourth of the principal errors directly. This verse hints at the generalization of this argument to the other two. If there is no permanent self, there is nothing to do the grasping that generates the view that there is happiness in samsara or to grasp onto the body. Since all of these errors are rooted in grasping, and since any inherently existent grasping would depend on an inherently existent grasper, these errors cannot be inherently existent. The next two verses emphasize the non-existence of both the error and the one in error from the ultimate standpoint.
16. If there is no grasping, whether erroneous or otherwise, who will come to be in error? Who will have no error? 17. Error does not develop in one who is in error. Error does not develop in one who is not in error. And, Nagarjuna points out, following the same pattern used in the analysis of motion and redeployed numerous times in the text, we can't think of error developing in one in whom error is arising. If the error is already arising in him, an independent error cannot be developing there. Moreover, as error develops, the person in whom it is developing changes, and no substrate for the development of error can be found. It follows that really existent error, conceived of as an independent phenomenon, is no more real than its putative subject, but of course no less real either. 18. Error does not develop in one in whom error is arising. In whom does error develop? Examine this on your own. The next two verses mobilize a by now familiar general argument against inherent existence, specifically against the inherent existence of error. Either error has arisen or it hasn't. If it has, it depends on something and so is not inherently existent. If it has not come to be and so is either non-existent or unexplained. Moreover, if error is to be conceived as inherently existent, it must arise from one of the four possible sources: self, other, both, or neither. And all four possibilities have been refuted for inherently existent entities in the general case in Chapter 1.
19. If error is not arisen, how could it come to exist? If error has not arisen, how could one be in error? 20. Since an entity does not arise from itself, nor from another and from itself, how could one be in error? Nagarjuna now returns to the objects of the four principal errors and points out that if they existed inherently, as the proponent of inherently existent error would have it, they would be truly existent and, hence, would be non-deceptive ultimate truths. 21. If the self and the pure, the permanent and the blissful existed, the self, the pure, the permanent, and the blissful would not be deceptive. But why is the opponent forced to think of the objects of inherently existent error as inherently existent? That is, of course, an obviously incoherent position. But the view characterized as an error must have some ontological basis. And the self that is putatively in error has already been ruled out. So the only remaining possibility is that the error is the perception of an inherently real, but at the same time deceptive object, a real but non-existent object. It is this that Nagarjuna claims is incoherent. Error then can neither be an objectless, but inherently existent mental phenomenon, nor can it be a subjectless perception of an inherently real but non-existent object. So in no way can error be grounded in anything substantial.
22. If the self and the pure. The permanent and the blissful did not exist, the non-self, the impure, the permanent. And suffering would not exist. But at this point Nagarjuna draws quite a surprising conclusion. These observations apply not only to the putative objects of the errors, but also to those of Buddhist doctrine, at least when it is given a substantialist reading. Continuing his critique of the idea that assertions made from the standpoint of conventional truth about the ultimate nature of things are literally true from the ultimate standpoint, Nagarjuna points out that the fact that there is no permanent self, no happiness in samsara, and no pure body does not entail that an impermanent self, suffering, or an impure body are in any way inherently existent. That is, the objects of correct conventional understanding are no more inherently existent than those of incorrect understanding. The truth of even Nagarjuna's own philosophical theory is not grounded in its reference to independently existent, substantially real entities. 23. Thus, through the cessation of error ignorance ceases. When ignorance ceases, the compounded phenomena, etc., cease. When all error is abandoned and we see the world aright, we are no longer ignorant of the true nature of things. But this is not because we then apprehend things and their true nature. Rather we apprehend that there are no things, per se, and that those posited from our side have no nature to understand.
24. If someone's defilements existed through his essence, how could they be relinquished? Who could relinquish the existent? Nagarjuna reminds the substantialist at the end that if the defilements or errors were inherent in the person and, hence, were part of his, her essence, they would be permanent and, hence, could not be relinquished. This would constitute a direct rejection of one of the most fundamental tenets of the Buddhist outlook, the possibility of liberation. 25. If someone's defilements did not exist through his essence, how could they be relinquished? Who could relinquish the non-existent? On the other hand, he reminds those who may have followed the argument this far, but who may be tempted either to nihilism about the defilements or to the subtler error of asserting that their dependence and emptiness is literally their ultimate nature, that the defilements must be conventionally real in order to be relinquished. They are, from the ultimate point of view, completely unreal. From that point of view, there is no relinquishment of anything at all. This, as we shall see, is an important harbinger of the doctrines of the identity of the two truths and of samsara and nirvana to be developed in the next two chapters, which represent the climax of the text.